Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar from DigitalHealth.London. I'm Matt Rigby from DigitalHealth.London and I'm here with Yinka McKinday, who many of you already know as our Programme Director. We're happy to be joined by Julian Hitchcock, who's an intellectual property and regulatory lawyer at Dunoon Legal. Julian has a particular focus on life science intellectual property and regulation and is frequently involved in UK and EU policy matters. Today, he's kindly agreed to take us through the importance of knowing your regulatory route to market. I'll just add that this isn't the first time that Julian's provided content for the DigitalHealth.London network. In addition to today's session, there's a podcast from him, all about IP, which you can listen to on our podcast channel. And just before we hand over, I'll give a little bit of context about these webinars generally. They're an opportunity for us to focus in on a specific area of support or a known challenge area for digital health SMEs throughout London. And this is the third and final session of our Autumn 2016 series. Last week we covered investment, and earlier in the month we looked at clinical trials. Recordings of all the sessions are available on the website, so do go and have a look if they're relevant to you. Now though, I'll hand over to Julian. He's going to take us through a presentation and there'll be opportunity for Q&A at the end. Okay, Julian.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. I'll just tell you in overview what I want to be able to take you through here. Is not the route so much, although I will definitely be showing you the route, but I want you to bear in mind the danger of getting to market and then discovering you're not allowed to be there, or you get into trouble if you endeavoured to do your thing. So knowing the regulatory route is going to be essential, and investors will expect you to comply. So this is briefly a little. That's the formal opening to our presentation. But this is all to tell you that everything I tell you is completely untrue. Right. So two big areas that I want to look at here. One is data protection, and one is the regulation of medical devices. And it may be that they don't. If you're involved in you're developing an app, say, that it may not feel like it's a device, and it may not be a medical device, but it might be. And I want to give you some idea of the framework that applies there. But first off, data protection. Now, data protection is a right which comes from European law. Now, at the end, maybe we'll talk about the position in relation to the UK law and in relation to Brexit and so on. But let's just put that to one side. Fundamentally, there is a data protection right which is set out in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is about a person's right to protection of personal data concerning them. And in that second point there, the data has to be processed fairly for specified purposes and on the basis of the consent of the person concerned or some other legitimate basis. Everyone has a right of access to the data which has been collected about them, and they have the right to have it rectified. And then final point there in this bit of the Charter of Fundamental Rights is that there can be an independent authority which, if you like, governs that. And in the UK, it's the Information Commissioner's Office. So that's the general right that we have. Now, many of you, I imagine, have already heard about the Data Protection Act. Well, aside from Brexit, I have to tell you that both the main areas of law that we're going to talk about are going to be replaced by new European legislation, bits of legislation. So the Data Protection Act, sure, you better comply with it, but you're actually going to have to meet a new standard under what's called the General Data Protection Regulation. Okay, and that's going to come in May 2018. Generally raises the standards and makes and brings more things within its rules, if you will. You're going to need to comply with that. It's a competitive opportunity because others won't do it, and it needn't be gruesome, but it has some technical impact. So if you're a developer, bear that in mind. One of the things I have to apologize about is, as a lawyer, we deal in words, so I really must apologize for the profusion of words. So what I'm going to give you here, I don't expect you to read every word of these slides, but it should give you an impression. But these are some of the main features under this new regime that comes in 2018. I want to pull out a few. The second one, let's say, is one which I think is particularly important: privacy by design. That means your systems, the very software you engineer into your systems, has got to have privacy and the rights of privacy wired in. And we'll see what those rights are, and you can reflect how developers can design software to do that. Data processors at the moment under the Data Protection Act don't have direct obligations. It's the data controller, the person who says what happens to personal data, who is directly subject to the Data Protection Act and equivalent bits of legislation around Europe. Under the new regime, the processors, the people who do the processing, have got direct legal obligations. There's also going to be a requirement to have data protection officers. So already you can see the standard being raised under this new regime. There's going to be a European Data Protection Board. We'll see where that goes, because obviously we're in a time of interesting times, as they say. But it's a higher regime. I'm not going to go through all those bullet points because we want to get some more big picture points across. Now, the big picture point that's really relevant to telemedicine, say, is the extraterritorial reach. So if an EU resident's personal data is processed or they're offered to them within the EU, then if it's all handled outside the EU, then that says in Bolivia, it's still going to be subject to EU law, even if it's in Bolivia or China or somewhere. Okay, there are going to be rules about data export. There already are, and the bottom line is that a breach of the rules has huge sanctions. So 2 to 4% of total world turnover. Now, if you're a small company, it's bad enough. If you can think about the scale of fines which say Facebook or Google face under this, they are absolutely monstrous. So they're huge sanctions. Now let's just think about how this impinges upon the people who buy your apps, let's say. Well, they're going to have increased rights, transparency. They want to see what's happening to their data. They want to know who's processing it and how. They want information and they want access to information about them and their personal data. That better be ready to hand. And then really important rights, which again, this goes to the privacy by design point. If they find something wrong, they might want to say, look, I want you to correct that, that's wrong. They might say, I don't want that aspect of my personal data being on your records, get rid of it. They might say, look, I don't want you to say that much about me. I just want to limit it to such and such. So they have this very plastic, very a high level of control over their personal data. And again, they might want to have notification about how it's used. And last point on that line, portability, which means that you might say, look, I'm absolutely fed up with company X, so company X, I'd like you to unplug all the data you already own about me so that I can carry it away and give it to company R because I like them so much. So if you can't do that, then potentially you've got a big problem. You have to be able to allow someone to, if you like, have modularized units of personal data that can be transferred. Consent, always important under under data protection, and we needn't dwell on that, I think, here, but it's an important issue all the time. Children, there are limits on children. Pseudonymization is important. Now, if you like, the answer to everything is just anonymize, and actually that is what is expected, that first effort should always be to try and anonymize data so that it can't be deciphered, and to use a pseudonym or code or something. I was at a talk by one of my colleagues in the Netherlands recently, and a guy from the Dutch Data Protection Office said the current state of anonymization is that anonymization can't be done because it becomes harder. And certainly if you think about the example of an orphan indication, an orphan disease, then that makes it more possible that someone can be identified even if they've got a code. So in practical terms there are issues there, but that's what we're aiming for. And there are particular obligations here that will arise in relation to personal data breaches. You can't just sit on it. You have got a limited amount of time, I can't remember, 14 days actually, in which to report a breach. Otherwise you are in a big trouble. And genetic and biometric data, particularly biometric data, is really important to many healthcare apps. They are dealt with specially. Now, I told you we got lots of words, so you don't need to really read so much of this. But all I wanted to point there was some words, and the words actually are encouraging, and they're words from the European Commission, which basically recognizes the value of big data. In other words, these convergent data sets and how they can be used, as it says in that second line, it's of great value. So coupling information from registers. So that's all. That's great, if you like. That's a good indication. Consent is important, as I said, and we're used, I think, at the moment to a fairly simple form of consent, under which someone says, for example, oh yeah, I consent to my personal data being used for research. That'll be fine. You sign the box, hand something in. No, 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 no. Much harder now. So you have to understand it, and certainly I just recently drafted a new compliant consent form in relation to a company which works in a range of genomics, biomics, metabolomics, and the user's got to understand each of those things, how they're being used, and then they must consent to the particular uses of those. So it's a much more granular approach to consent. And the distinguishable bit is important. So I consent to this particular use, but not that one. And this idea of not bundling. So each of those consents has got to be distinct. Again, I think it has an answer in software and how these things are approached. Again, privacy by design. So and at a second, but last bullet point, you can't just say, yeah, if you want these services, you better consent. No, it won't work. And of course, you've got to be able to withdraw. So consent, really important. Now, again, we're not going to look at all the words except for the underlined ones. I just want you underline the words location data, online identifier, physiological genetic material, because they're obviously relevant in the context of a healthcare app. Not necessarily genetic, although it can be, and maybe cultural and social for that matter. But these are things which are deeply tied up with the use of mobile apps and associated technologies, and which will show you, which I think illustrate how these can become invoked, how data protection law is invoked in relation to healthcare or even wellness apps. So, and this really makes the point in relation to specific definition, data concerning health. And again, just looking at some of those things, there should be enough there, I think, to get you to see how this is relevant to healthcare apps. So, so it could refer to a number symbol, something which identifies someone particularly, and then there could be other information derived from testing for bodily substances. Now, in this talk, I'm actually not going to talk, when we come to devices, about in vitro diagnostic devices, which are apps. And that's simply because of time. But it can happen. So you can, for example, have an app which looks at a urine strip. There was an example called UCheck. So use a standard bit of paper dipped into a urine sample, then you show it to the phone, and the phone makes a diagnostic analysis. That, if you like, is an in vitro test, and there are others. I'm not going to talk about those specifically. For the present purpose, it tracks the medical device rules that we'll come to. But of course, from the point of view of data protection couldn't care less whether it's in vitro or it's in an implanted device or anything. It's just the rules about data concerning health. So it's a broad description. And I mentioned that a particular aspect of personal data of relevance to our area here is biometric data. And there again, see how that runs in specific technical processing related to the physical, physiological or behavioral characteristics of an individual, which allows or confirms unique identification of that individual. Yeah, I think we know what that means. So healthcare, what we want out of healthcare data is almost what we don't want in about any other area of data. We don't want it shared, we don't want it used in a particular way, but when it's our health, we would, by and large, want to be able to get maximum leverage from that and make it valuable to us from a healthcare point of view. And yeah, there it is. So biometric data is a specific sort of data that's recognized. And genetic data. So again, I mentioned in vitro testing, but bear in mind also that genetic data is, to a very large extent, possibly even an increasing extent, in silico. So it may be stored somewhere else. You may spit in a pot for 23andMe or some Omixy or someone. But ultimately the data is going to be held on the database somewhere. Well, it's still going to be genetic data. Again, a broad remit and something which is accessible by remote devices, software on laptops and other devices. Now, and this is an important point because there is the default position is it's not allowed to process. You're not allowed to process genetic data or biometric data, just imagine that with a lot of apps, in order to uniquely identify a person or data about their health or sex life and sexual orientation. So there are limits there. That's the background position, but of course there is an unless that there's explicit consent from the data subject to the specific purposes for the processing of that data for one or more specified purposes, and then some other reasons like it's necessary to protect the vital interests of the data subject or another person. That second bullet point down under the unless really pertains to, if you like, the healthcare context in which there is actually say a doctor involved, and similarly with the last one. But if you bear in mind that basic prohibition by default and focus on the need for explicit consent, you can see how important this is going to be generally. Now, the margin of appreciation, what do I mean by that? Well, particularly relevant, one might say, politically at the moment, but actually this is the position that we have at the moment under union law, under the European Union law, is that actually member states in relation to areas such as, in this case, genetic data and biometric data and health data, member states have got a lot of discretion. Now, European Union law doesn't and never has controlled the practice of medicine. That's something which is outside its scope. You wouldn't believe it at the moment, would you, the way people talk? But the devices and equipment that may be used in relation to genetic data, biometric data, or health data, obviously they're controlled. But how they're used? Well, the point here under this, under the GDPR, under the General Data Protection Regulation, is to give member states the opportunity to add regulatory burdens. So I've told you what the basis under the General Data Protection Regulation are going to be under about genetic data and biometric data. And the truth is that other member states can add provisions. So they can actually, in relation to genetic data and biometric data, they're entitled to make things more difficult. So, for example, in Germany, for very good historical reasons, one might say, has a lot of sensitivity about data protection, actually, about monitoring of an individual, and it certainly has some sensitivities about genetics. And so people are very chary there about the use of genetic data, and just allowing someone to have a genetic test, say, online is more of a deal. Let's just put it that way in the time we've got. Now, profiling. Now, this is a really important thing. Now, you know when you use Facebook and it says, hey, you're really interested in camping. And you go, so how did it know? Yeah, you want to go to this camping site. Because, how did they know? Well, because on some other site you happen to say, well, where can I get a stove heater for something, or a rucksack? Oh, yeah, this guy likes camping. That's actually an exercise in profiling. So it's a form of automated processing of personal data, which is used to analyze and predict aspects of a person's performance at work. And of course, health. So this is dealt with very particularly. It's a specifically recognized form of data processing, which is, as it says in that second bullet point, it's an automated decision making and profiling based on special categories of personal data should only be allowed under specific conditions, which will come as a relief to many. So again, the default position is you can't do that anymore, and there will be some guidance issued by the European Data Protection Board, which doesn't exist yet, and goodness knows what we'll have instead from the UK point of view, but it'll be basically the same. Another right is the right to be forgotten. I'm fed up of being on your website. I'm fed up of your app. I want you to remove all records to me. Well, that is a right. That is a right of data protection. It's a fundamental right, and you need to be able to build it into your system to enable that to happen. So just bear that in mind as an important and essential right to build in technically. And I alluded earlier to data portability. So the idea of modularizing a user's data so that it can be pulled out, unplugged, nothing else is left there, and they can take it away. The question is, how does that work? So let's just see what it is that they expect under here. So the data subject has the right to receive the personal data concerning him or her, which he's provided to a controller, in a structured and commonly used and machine-readable format. Doesn't specify what that is. And have the right to transmit those data to another controller without hindrance from the controller to which the data have been provided. So they want this seamless system in place whereby, if necessary, painful as it would be, you could just bundle up all that, a module of a person's data and go, right, off it goes, and squirt it down a wire to some other happy recipient. You've got to be able to do that. So what do you do now? Well, I said May 2018 is when this comes in. You don't want to be scrambling around in May 2018 trying to get everything up to scratch and discovering that we can't even, our thing is not even allowed to be on the market. You've got to get things going now. You've got to get things lined up. Now, so quick checklist. You need to prepare some data protection policies and practices, okay, and be prepared, and procedures for breach. So if there's a breach, you're going to have to know, well, how do I deal with this? Because breaches do happen, and you're going to have to report them, actually. And if you don't, then that's much, much more serious. So I mentioned differences over biometric data and genetic data between member states. So insofar as you're moving data around, or you're using data, you're working in Germany, say, or other EU member states, just keep an eye out for member state rules on those sort of health data to see how they differ, if it's relevant to you. You need, as a matter of principle, under the new regulation, to have an accountability framework, so that you have agreements about, I'm the controller, you're the processor, this is what you're going to do. So you have a clear framework of accountability. You'll do that, you're going to subcontract that, this data subject's going to know because of X and Y. So you have to build in that framework. I've spoken throughout this part of the talk about privacy and design. So privacy and accountability. So I've just mentioned the framework you'd have. Privacy by design. Can you actually achieve these objectives under data protection law? Technically, you need to do that. And you've got to be able to just check, because someone will ask you, what is the legal basis that I have got for processing or storing, this person's personal data? If you haven't got any legal basis, then you are in breach because you're effectively controlling someone's personal data without their consent. So you've got to build in that to start with. It'll make you feel much happier and you'll sleep far better. And privacy notes. So go through the privacy notes you have with your customers and the policies, management. So have an overall review there. Be ready for the awkward customer who says, I actually would quite like to be forgotten, and I'm sure you'd like to forget them as well. And then just go through the various obligations. So who's going to pay for this part of it all? Is the data processor paying for this? Is the controller paying for that? And then will you be exporting personal data? So we in the European Economic Area, which is, so supposing the UK leaves the European Union, that still leaves the European Union, Norway, Switzerland, and Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So you have, you'd still be subject to the same rules, but exporting data to the US is much more problematic, and that's a bit of a moving target. We've got a holding pattern at the moment with exporting personal data to the US, but it's not a good one. So, but you need to review those grounds. Okay, so that, if you like, is I'm going to come back. Sorry, that's a very, very quick rundown over data protection. It's changing. You need to act. You need to get things ready now. Now, let's talk about device regulation. Okay, device regulation is also changing. And but what I'm going to do in this part of the talk is I'm going to talk very quickly about device regulation and then how it's going to change. Okay, so first of all, what is a device? Now, again, I'm not going to ask you to get bogged down in all the tedious words here, but I want to give you some idea of the, if you like, the architecture here. So the basic idea is that member states like the UK, Portugal, Sweden, wherever, have got to implement laws. That's what taking all necessary steps are, to ensure that devices can be placed on the market or put into service only if they comply with the requirements laid down in the directive. In other words, this directive, which is called the Medical Devices Directive, set some standards, and then your device, if it is a device, have to comply with that. Quickly, you'll see there are some other ones. I've mentioned an active implantables medical devices directive. Yeah, they're different, and I've mentioned in vitro ones as well. We're not going to talk about those, as I said. They sort of basically track the same principles. So let's look at some in this definition of a medical device. What leaps out at us here? Well, first of all, the purpose bit, that's the bit in bold there. So if something, whatever it is used for the purposes of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, should we say, or investigation, replacement, or modification of the anatomy, or of a physiological process, or control of conception, well, that's a purpose which is consistent with that of a medical device, as long as it doesn't do, and that very bottom 3 lines, isn't a drug. So that's what that means. Pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means it's a drug. Forget that. We're looking at that purpose: monitoring, treatment, investigation of a physiological process, control of conception, those sort of purposes. Now we can think of all sorts of bits of kit that can do that, but what about software? Well, reading up to that top paragraph, you can see that, yeah, software is in there. So if it's intended that some software some software is to be used for diagnostic or therapeutic purposes, then potentially it is a device. So you can probably already see how that can apply. Now, so what might be involved? Well, embedded software, standalone software, but there must be that intention. If there was no intention for it to be used for those purposes, the ones that we talked about before, then it's not a medical device. So you might have that software, and the purpose might be to wash your windows or something or other, or to entertain you. Then it won't be a medical device. Now, when I just jokingly said to entertain you, that's actually what a lot of people try. So they go, ha, 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 ha. It's just for entertainment only, this heart monitoring device or this device for checking whether your mole is actually cancerous. It's just for entertainment, really. No, it doesn't work. The regulators know perfectly well what, by context, how something, the intended purpose of something. Now, okay, so we've got an idea of what a device is. Sometimes devices have accessories, and so the device itself may not be software. It could be that you've got some software in your phone or in your laptop or wherever, which is an accessory to something which actually is a medical device, and vice versa. So the directive simply treats them the same way. So if you like, the bit of wire leading into something is as much it might be essential, so it's an accessory, it's necessary to make the device work, but it has to be CE marked accordingly. So it just shows you how the scope is quite wide. Sorry about these gaps, that's because in a different version of this presentation I like to show how this tracks with in vitros. But there we are with an accessory. Again, it's intended that it's specifically to be used with a device. Right, remember this, let's just pull focus again. So I said that why it mattered being a device is that member states have got to introduce laws to make sure that there is compliance with some essential requirements. So what are these essential requirements? Well, they're set out in the directive. The MDD is the Medical Device Directive. IVDD means in vitro medical device directive. So how does that work? Let's look at that. So devices must meet the essential requirements set out in Annex 1. We're all going to be looking at Annex 1, which takes into account the intended purpose concerned. Okay, so that's the basic architecture. Don't worry about the rest of that slide. So let's just have a look, an overview of what this means. Your question is it a medical device? Because if it is, I'm going to have to comply with something. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, so now that I've worked out it's a medical device according to that broad definition, what sort of risk is it? Now, the reason that we ask that question is because the different classes of medical device are actually graded according to risk. Okay, so there'll be different rules which enable you to establish what they are. And I'm just going to show you, there they are. So 1, 2A, 2B, 3. 1 is low-grade risk, 3 is very big risk, and we're not concerned for present purposes with the outside ones. So there are some basic rules here. So software that drives a device or influences a device falls in the same class. Big picture, I want you to just focus on classification rule 10. Never mind the top and bottom ones for now. So if a direct diagnosis or monitoring of a vital physiological process is involved, it's a class 2A device. If on top of that the nature of the variations is such that it could result in immediate danger to the patient if you get it wrong, then it's going to move up to a 2B. So that gives you an idea of how this works. There is help available, and we'll come to some shortly. This is from a European Commission document, and again, just give you an idea how it sort of runs. So you can look at this. You start there, and it asks you basic questions, and you go along with the logic, and it'll take you through to the next stage. So at the end, it's like a pinball machine. It'll tell you whether something is a device or not. That's just if it's a device, never mind the classification. Okay. There is other advice available as to sort of what is and isn't going to fall within as a device in the first place, and if so, what they are. So advice on information systems, expert systems, electronic patient files, and so on. The advice is available there. Generally, the MHRA, which is the UK regulator for devices, Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Agency, thinks that electronic health records are unlikely to be considered medical devices because it's just archival and retrieval. It's just equivalent to a traditional paper system. So they think that it generally won't be. But if it has some sort of interpretive, analytic element to it or performs a calculation, then it's likely that it will be. Okay, so that's just a general broad brush statement. And again, at this broad brush level, you could just look at how this works. So on the left, you've got sort of wellness stuff, which isn't regulated, shall we say, and on the right you've got stuff that definitely is. The words that I've used there just give you an idea of suggestions as to what's likely to take something in a direction. So if it's just searching, transferring, moving, storing, displaying, counting, that's likely not to be a device. It's just presenting information, if you like it. But when you move forward to the other end, when something calculates, controls, diagnoses, or monitors, then you're in there. Now, there is some help, because this is obviously a ludicrously short amount of time to give you this information, I can't do it. What I can do is to advise you to have a good look at the MHRA website, and in particular for the guidance on software applications, which you can find. And this is just a screenshot from it. It's interactive, so you can download the PDF document and it's got hyperlinks within it. It's very good. A lot of work's gone into it, so do look at that. I mentioned some rough guides. I think you probably get that, this sort of idea from that guidance, because we plainly don't have time to go into this. But this just gives you an idea of what you will find from there. So the suggestive words we mentioned: amplify, measures, probably a medical device, decision support systems, dose calculators, symptom trackers, probably a medical device, apps acting as accessories to medical devices. We talked again about how accessories are treated as medical devices. So it gives you this level of understanding, and I would encourage you to go through that, look at your device, measure it up against what the MHRA, the regulator, thinks is a device, and go from there. Right, if it's not, so more ideas: storing and weight data, transferring data, we said that isn't. Something used for diabetes therapy probably is. You've got the idea. So some more ideas then about what it is. But the smartphones themselves do not become medical devices. If it is a regulated device, what are you going to do? Well, let's go through this step. First of all, you want to define what the medical purpose is. You're going to need to classify it. Remember, there's that pinball thing. You then need to go through a conformity assessment procedure, and to do that, you'd actually get a regulatory consultant. I am not a regulatory consultant, I'm a lawyer. You go to a regulatory consultant, and they will hold your hand, take you through the process of conformity assessment. That's the process at the end of which you get your CE mark, and you can place something on the market. If you haven't, then you cannot place it on the market, the whole point of this talk. In the process of that conformity assessment procedure, essentially the name of the game is meeting harmonized standards, technical standards necessary for that sort of kit. You'll also need, if you're going to put something on the market, have a risk management plan. You've got to build in a quality management system to ensure quality. You're going to have a system for validating the software, and ultimately you get CE marking. Final bullet point there, a very important point in this context: the change of versions of software may require a new CE certificate, CE mark. Which sounds a bit alarming, but let me take you through that. So if, for example, the operating system changes your app into a different app, which I think it probably does, then you need a new CE mark. Now that sounds like an utter nightmare. Now there are various ways to avoid that, and the first one is to anticipate it. Design your software in such a way that it won't change if there's a change in the operating system. You can have notification systems, so it sort of stops working if there's a change in that, so you can't be accused of putting something on the market, or that's you know, if that's the case. You can try and seek a prior warning of changes, and you can work with your regulatory consultant so as to be able to make changes very swiftly, so you can just update them and then you have a new CE mark thing. So I think that's something to unpack and actually, if necessary, discuss with the MHRA, because it's all new and they're treading they're in new territory as well. So there again, some few basic bullet points which I think we've largely talked about, but you must be ready to behave as if it is a device, and it would be a device. So all the things that go with that, such as post-market surveillance, adverse incident reporting, those all apply that you get. Right, that is just about brings me to the end, but not quite. I mentioned that European law has changed, and we've just recently had passed on, amusingly enough, June the 25th, I think it was, a new medical device regulation, and this clarifies the new rules, which will apply with the new regulation. Basically, it raises the bar, and I just want to draw your attention to the word indirectly. So we haven't got time to look at that in great detail, but if I just say that in general it tends to widen the scope so that more apps which previously and currently would not be regarded as devices now are, then you should be aware of that. And in case you're in any doubt, it's what's called under European law an information society service. So, so if there's an accessory or device that's offered to people without the parties being around, then it's in the same place. It's called information society service, and devices offered by means of such information society services, establishing a union must comply with the conditions of the new medical devices regime. I'm not going to give you any more information on this because I know it's an absolute faithful or an earful, so I have to apologize for all this, but I think it is important as you face the way ahead to begin off by charting your regulatory route to market. If you do not, and you arrive at the market and discover that you weren't allowed to be there, you can't market your product, you are in trouble. So avoid that opportunity, allow the competitors to fall into the elephant traps, and good luck.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julian. Always have a lot of pleasure in hearing your talks and your ability to turn quite a complex subject, which is very foreign to a lot of people, into something which is understandable. So we've got probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes left. This is your opportunity really to ask some questions if you have any. I know, recognizing that there's a lot to absorb, but it's a really good opportunity to ask Julian a question or two if you have any. Just to kick off though, Julian, I know you've covered it in bits throughout your presentation, but really one of the questions that I have on my mind is Brexit, really, and I'm sure some others will on the line. So if you could sort of summarize for us quite succinctly, what are the impacts that we should expect to see in the wake of Brexit?
Practically, you should assume that everything carries on exactly as it is, that the data protection regulation will apply when we're still a member of the European Union anyway. The Information Commissioner has made it clear that she considers that the law will stay the same. It's possible on data protection that down the track there may be a review of data protection regulation. I think it unlikely. There is certainly some political pressure to reduce data protection, which is from the US. I think there will be some resistance from the UK to that, but I wouldn't see any immediate change. So a lot is unknown politically, indeed, even whether actually ever will be a Brexit. In terms of devices, again, I think the assumption should be that we comply with this standard. From a practical point of view, the hard truth is that the rules are just the rules of a market, the market of the European Union, where there are an awful lot of customers. And so even if the European Union blew up, the rules would, I'm sure, still continue, and that there would be earnest attempts to make sure that they were harmonized, and you'd end up with a court and everything. So it's a bit like Voltaire's God, you know. If it didn't exist, it'd be necessary to create it, that system of rules, irrespective of politics or anything, just as a trading point of view. So I think there's not much likelihood of there being, in fact, I think there's almost no likelihood of there being special British rules on medical device apps. I think it would be utterly bonkers. I know that Liam Fox has said, rather astonishingly, that he considers that the UK should have its own life science rules. Well, I'm a life science lawyer. Very interesting comment.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question is that when you were talking about the medical devices legislation, you highlighted that there are different risk grades of device regulation. I'm just quite keen to find out whether there's an easy way for innovators to classify what is the correct level to be aiming at for their particular device.
Yes, Yinka. The correct way really is to get hold of the MHRA website and to look for their guidance, which I think is just excellent. It's, you know, it is like a pinball machine, but it's the best way. It's rather like with patents. The best way is to begin off by actually doing your own patent searches and getting wised up to things. I think that's the best starting point. Once you get into it and you come across issues where, like borderlines, then I think it might be appropriate to get onto a regulatory consultant, or indeed notified bodies would probably advise on suitable ones, but or we can, but get someone to hold your hand through the process of getting compliance. But begin off with the MHRA is the best way.
Okay, so you've mentioned that you're obviously not a regulatory consultant.
No.
So when would if there's an innovator out there on this call now who's thinking about, okay, well, we're starting to think about this, when would they come and see someone like you?
Gosh, all sorts of law. Well, it's as I say, it's a route to market, and the road of true love never did run straight, or whatever it was. There are issues that can arise on the way. I don't think it's for me now to say, look, there could be problems, because I think we should be positive about this. But yeah, there can be issues, and
such as, can you give us some?
Yeah, sure. A good example would be a regulator says this is, let's take this example. This is a medical device, and we say no, it isn't. Or this is a class 3 medical device. You go, no way, it's class 2. Things such as that we find ourselves involved with amongst other areas. So when you get into the nitty-gritty of the whole process, you can find yourself dealing directly with regulators, and sometimes you may not like what they have to say. So that's a place where we come in. So that people are aware, people often talk about law and regulation as if they were separate things. A regulation is a servant of the law, and its only reason for being there, its only way of being valid in any way, is because it's allowed to be made under a law. So that's where you hear about judicial review. So we can do a lot to help on those grounds, and you know, we can certainly advise about regulation, but we don't want to do filings or anything like that.
No.
I don't think you're in a far better place to do that.
Okay. So if there are no further questions, if no one's out there looking to sort of take the opportunity to ask Julian a question right now, then I think it just leaves us to say thank you very much for your time, very valuable time this afternoon, and for taking us through a lot of detail, but in a way which hopefully most of you have been able to take some value from. Oh, we've got a question?
We might have a question from Caitlin, actually.
Okay.
Caitlin, okay. I'm just going to try and unmute you. You should be able to speak.
Hello, Caitlin.
I was just typing really fast, but I couldn't type fast enough.
Yeah.
I have a question, because so I'm working for a company and we're hoping to start CE marking for a product that we have very soon. We think it's a class 1 medical device, non-sterile under classification 12 of the rule 12, yeah. And so we've been in contact with a regulatory consultant currently, and so as far as I understand, I'm just trying to understand a little bit about the harmonized standards. So, I mean, there's certain standards which are encompassed in the medical device standards. For example, there's like our product has a laser in it, right? So the 60825 standard is so when I've been engaging with like a testing house about 60825, I'm just wondering if that can just move into 60601 or whatever the medical device standard is. So I'm just wondering how many other standards can be. So as far as I understand it, it's like if you test to this one, it'll be encompassed under MEDDEV, and that'll be okay. But I'm just wondering how many different ones of these standards that are for general consumers can actually be kind of encompassed into the medical device standards. Because I know, is that what harmonized standards means? Because I'm not.
Yes, it does. So the medical device directive that we talked about in its Annex 1, that's the bit which sets out the rules for which class you're in, but it also sets out the particular standards, and those tend to be things like electrical goods standards, or radiation, or as you mentioned, lasers, for example. So what the annex is doing, and this is where the regulatory consultant really comes into their own, because I have to tell you, I don't deal with this end of things at all, but they will go through each of those technical aspects of the device in question and essentially measure them up against the standard under the the harmonized standard that's expected. So that's how that works.
So okay.
There are loads. I mean, it just depends what it is. So the answer is really, what the system is.
Okay. Thanks.
Does that help, Caitlin?
Yeah. So we need to continue speaking to our regulator.
Yes, you should. You should do
about this, because it's very specific. But I was just wondering if you kind of knew of any other standards off the top of your head. But I guess it encompasses all aspects.
Caitlin, there are a lot of them, but it wouldn't really help if I began to list them now anyway.
No, of course.
The answer is that they are all effectively in the annex, and the regulatory consultant's job is to identify what your product is, what technical standards under Annex 1 must be met, and meet those standards, so that the regulator can then go to the notified body and say, look, here's evidence that it meets this standard, that standard, and the other one, and then hopefully you get a CE mark. That's just how it goes, really.
So it's like there's not like a repeating of standards across, from medical devices to general consumer things. That's what a harmonized standard is. I'm just trying to understand that. So
no, I'm sorry, I'm being a bit sloppy there, and in fact, there are some specific standards. Obviously, if something is a product, the fact that it's a medical device doesn't mean that it's not subject to other laws, of course. So, I don't know, let's think of an example, lead paint. So you paint it with lead, it's not something which, would be specified under medical device law, I would imagine, except maybe indirectly. But you're not allowed to paint things with lead paint, basically. So that would be another standard.
Okay.
Not that I'm an expert on lead paint regulation, I have to tell you.
Okay. Well, I guess if Julian has kindly left his email address, but also you're happy to share your slides after this presentation.
Fine, yeah.
So we'll make those available to everyone who was on the call. And once again, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in. We'll make the recording available shortly, and we'll be back in touch with you regarding our next series. Thank you very much. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.